So today we have Miss Christine Holmes here. So she's going to take uh, webinar on stress management, self and community care. So I would like to welcome Professor Anil Kumar to give the welcome speech.
Oh no, there's no welcome speech as such. So I just want to welcome all of you and thank you, Ms. Christian Darcel Holmes, for attending this webinar. And we know that it's a very odd time for you at 3 o'clock early morning at your place. You're associated to University of Pennsylvania. And she also has a lot of Indian connections. She worked in Chennai for quite some time. And thank you, Mr. Tamre, for arranging this lecture. So the Wellness Center at IISc started a couple of years back, and the Wellness Center is arranging activities like these webinars. Every month, 1 or 2 webinars are being arranged. Now it's a very challenging time, especially because of COVID. The connection between the people are much less. That is also adding to the stress among the people, and also a lot of uncertainties, etc. So that's why, the good thing is that, we are not alone. Everybody in the world is having the same problem. So in that sense, it's not our own problem. It's a problem for everyone around the world. So that is the consolation here. And the Wellness Center has got, apart from this webinar activities, also has counselors in the campus. We have wellness coordinators staying along with the students in the hostel. And we have clinical psychologists and psychiatrists in the campus. And also we have external experts where the community can reach out and then seek help. And also we do have online platform 24/7 emergency hotline with your Dost, where your calls will be attended by a trained psychologist on the other side. A mental health professional will attend your calls on the other side. And also they arrange online counseling platform. So I request all the students and the community within the IISc campus to make use of all these avenues. And all of us are there, and all these resources are available for our help. Please make use of these resources, and also recommend to your friends who are in need of these resources also. With this, may I invite Mr. Tamre to proceed with the proceedings for today. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So if you have any questions, you can post in chat box or raise hands. So we can once our presentation will stop, Christine Holmes will be answering those questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking a part of your Saturday to be with us. Thank you to Professor Anil Kumar, Damrai, Catherine, and Sri Lakshmi for having me, as well as the entire Wellness Center of the Indian Institute of Science. My name is Christine Holmes, and I am a licensed clinical social worker and an adjunct lecturer at the Columbia University School of Social Work. I was actually introduced to Damarai and his colleagues through a friend of mine who I worked with when I was living and working in Chennai. I worked with an NGO called the Banyan. So some of you might be familiar. The Banyan serves people who have serious mental illness, who are experiencing homelessness. They also ran the TIS campus in Chennai, where I was visiting faculty and taught for 2 years. I left India sadly 2 years ago, and part of my heart remains in India. So I'm overly delighted to be with you today. I also wanted to clarify, I actually live in Jakarta, Indonesia now, so the time difference isn't quite terrible. It's only a little bit later in the afternoon, so that worked out really well. In the process of preparing for this presentation, I was honored to meet Damarai and learn about the incredible work that your social workers and your wellness center is doing. I've also heard wonderful things about the student body and your commitment and your thoughtfulness to taking care of yourselves during such a demanding time while you are part of a rigorous academic program. At Columbia School of Social Work, I actually teach with the online campus to graduate students, and I have the pleasure of teaching just other hardworking students who are pursuing a career in social work. I teach them how to work with and advocate for people experiencing social hardships. For my doctoral studies, I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Pennsylvania, and my topic is actually on the topic of caregiving burden. That is the stress of caregiving in caring for parents as they get older. So my presentation today will be based on a mix of things, both my experience in supporting my students as they manage stress related to social work practice and being a student in the pandemic, and also what I've learned over the years about the impact of stress on a personal, social, and cultural level. Next slide. Our objectives for today, or my objectives, the first is to examine the cultural and social implications of stress, to assess the personal signs of stress, to understand how stress and relationships interact with the brain, to recognize the role of social relationships to promote resilience against stress, and to start an action plan for self-care and community care. Next slide. Our agenda is to discuss the role of stress in higher education and society, social and physiological reactions to stress, the stress process model, social support as a resource to limit the effect of daily stressors, and steps towards self-care and community care. Next slide. Oh, perfect. Thank you. So we'll start off with this reflection. Please take a look at this list of stressors. Which of these apply to you? Living away from home, academic demands and test anxiety, finances, relationships, either with family or romantic, post-graduation plans. You can respond in the chat, or you can privately just reflect on these stressors and which ones might be resonating for you right now as a student. Next slide. So these are just some common stressors, not an exhaustive or comprehensive list, but just a few that students experience in higher education. Being a student can be very rewarding. It has its moments, but also quite stressful, especially when you and others hold yourself to high expectations. I wanted to start off this presentation by sharing the current climate of mental health for university students in the United States. Next slide. Prior to the start of COVID-19, the prevalence of mental health problems of post-secondary students was increasing significantly. One study found that almost 40% of students, or 8 million students, were experiencing a significant mental health problem. The same survey found that 60% of college students were having difficulty accessing mental health care because their campus, or actually before their campuses even had to close for COVID for social distancing requirements. So this was before February and March of 2020. These historic events have driven the increase in anxiety and depression. Three historic events have driven the increase in anxiety and depression across the US population. In addition to the pandemic, we experienced a rise in unemployment in response to the pandemic, as well as the social inequality across communities of the US. Although from the outside, America's social issues might not seem that remarkable, within its borders, there are stark differences in how people are treated based on their race and other identities, and that impact of the degree of stress that people experience, including students. One of our biggest think tanks, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, released a report last year based on a nationwide study called Mental Health, Substance Use, and Wellbeing in Higher Education, Supporting the Whole Student. They conducted a survey across universities in the United States and found that nearly 80% of post-secondary educators believe that emotional well-being of students was a very or extremely important factor to student success. 80% of educators. Nearly every institution of higher education in the US provides some version of mental health and substance use counseling, but this has led some college and university leaderships to assume that these centers are enough to address the mental health problems that students are facing. According to the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, these centers were insufficient, and institutions needed to do two things to address student well-being. The first is to focus on prevention, identification of high-risk students, effective community-based approaches, treatment for identified cases, and relapse prevention. So a lot of focus on prevention. The second recommendation was a change in institutional culture that contributes to the increase of mental health and well-being concerns. We need to emphasize shared responsibility and a holistic understanding to sufficiently support students. Next slide. Despite these recommendations, we are still dealing with powerful social and cultural factors that promote excess work and competition. I believe this is partly in response to social distancing measures in COVID. We have been forced to slow ourselves down and challenge these ideas that we are only worth something if we are accomplishing something. In the US, we call this grind culture or hustle culture. Have you heard of these before? Grind culture or hustle culture? Maybe you call it something else. But this is the focus on productivity that comes from our history in the US of European colonization and the value of capitalism. Now, the Columbia School of Social Work and other schools are beginning to acknowledge how unhealthy and toxic these values have been to our students and ourselves. And we're slowly working to shift the culture away from productivity toward more self-care. But to be honest, it has not been an easy process, and it's something that we have to work on every day, right? It's a process of unlearning and relearning something new. Next slide. In the discussion on self-care, it's very helpful to begin with the ways that we can understand stress. Next slide. What happens to your bodies when you are stressed? If you could type in the chat for me, what happens? What do you feel in your body when you are stressed? How do you know? What does your body tell you? How does it change? How do you know when you're stressed? You can guess, you're probably right. Yes, palpitations, I feel this. My heart is racing, right? Overthinking, the thoughts are cycling. Restlessness, my breathing gets very fast. Anything else? What else happens in your body when you're feeling stressed? Sweating, inability to focus, so difficult to focus and remember. Absolutely, great answers here. So we experience a fight or flight response, which I'm sure you've heard of before. So again, our hearts beat faster, our breathing is faster, our vision gets sharper and narrows. So we see what we call tunnel vision, right? We don't see what's around us as well. Our blood pressure goes up and our bodies release stress hormones. So we're not thinking about hunger or other biological functions. But what happens when our bodies stay stressed over a long period of time? Does anyone know? When you have chronic stress, what happens to your body? What changes? I imagine you have heard about this or might know a family member that's had chronic stress. What happens to your body when these physiological changes are persistent? It can have a really negative effect, right? You can have some chronic health conditions. Next slide. For students, stress can change your physical, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral states of being. So for the physical stress, this in your body might look like eczema or psoriasis, just extremely dry, itchy skin. You might develop heart conditions like hypertension, maybe some body pain if you're feeling tight muscles, achiness in your back, your neck, right? Or your stomach. Headaches as well. I don't know if anyone gets headaches. Yes, hormonal imbalances and you have like high cortisol levels in your body, right? Very bad for your cardio health. Emotional stress can feel like nervousness, long periods of sadness. Maybe your friends note some of your changes if you're having mood swings, moods that are going up and down all of a sudden. Cognitive changes, your mental functioning, which I think you mentioned. Focusing is hard, remembering things, your ability to recall information is compromised. Maybe you're having negative thoughts about yourself that cycle over and over again. In terms of behavioral changes, you might have more absences, or maybe you're showing up late to class or meetings when you were not doing that before. Perhaps you're starting to eat some unhealthy things that you normally were not eating, or you're having more accidents. Maybe you're prone to hurting yourself by mistake more often, right? So those are just some examples, not comprehensive, but some changes you might notice when you are being subjected to stress or your body's under a lot of stress. Immunity is compromised. That's a great one. Absolutely. Right. So you might be prone to getting sick, catching colds, viruses. Good responses. Thank you, everybody. Next slide. So these are all signs of stress that can lead to depression, burnout, or higher levels of illness. Has anyone heard of burnout before? What does it feel like if you had to guess what burnout is? It's a little bit different. It's like stress, but a little different. Burnout, even in the name burnout. What could that mean? Yes, you lose the energy to do anything. You don't feel like doing anything. What else? Right? So you lack motivation. Your productivity goes down. And this can be after a long period of feeling stressed, especially with work or academics. It's a complete drop of energy. Yes, tired all the time. Maybe you're starting to have a mental distance from the work or negative feelings about the work that you're doing, and a significant decrease in your performance. Burnout often comes from working way too much and having less time for the other parts of your life. So there's this imbalance and lack of harmony between your work and other domains and family and social life and other things that bring you joy. In 2016, the World Health Organization released a study, which was the first global analysis of its kind on the topic of burnout. Interestingly, they found people who worked 55 hours or more per week had a 35% higher risk of stroke and 17% higher risk of heart disease compared to those people who are only working between 35 to 40 hours. Working more than 55 hours a week led to an estimated 750,000 deaths from stroke and heart disease around the world every year. Interestingly, for university students, the most predictive stressor of burnout were actually academic stressors, whereas depression was most commonly related to stressors such as financial stability and family support. So I thought that was really interesting as it applied to academia. Next slide. One of the most popular models to help us understand stress is Perlin's stress process model, which has been applied to different studies over the last 30 years. Next slide. So depending on the size of your screen right now, those of you that have a bigger screen might be able to see this diagram. At the very top, it says social structure. So you see that? And in social structure, you'll also see it contains social stratification, institutions, and relationships. So that's sort of an overarching frame, is social structure. Does anyone know what social stratification is? What does that refer to when we talk about social stratification? What is social stratification? And it's okay to guess. But the way that I think about social stratification is that it's a division. It's a social division of people. It can be a hierarchy within society. Yes, exactly. Hierarchy is great. So that helps me remember what social stratification is. And depending on your society and your environment, social stratification can be different things. It can look different. So in the US, because of our colonial history, social stratification is organized around race because that's what we put into law. Um, And so it's helpful to understand who you are coming into a stressor. If you come from at the bottom of a social stratification hierarchy, you might have a different time handling and a different sort of experience of stressors than other people who don't have those same stressors coming in. So the first unit at the top of this diagram refers to traumas, life events, daily hassles, non-events, chronic stressors, and chronic trauma. Right below it, right underneath this unit, you'll see intermediary processes, and this box interacts with our resources to handle stress. From much research, we've learned that personal and social resources can offset the mental health effects of stressors. So you'll see that in that resources box. Next slide. When we zoom into this diagram, we see that the resources, social support, mastery, self-esteem, social integration, social capital, mattering, hardiness, and coping, right? So all of these can impact our mental health, physical health, role transitions, and status attainment. For today's presentation, we're going to focus on that top resource, social support. And social support is the belief that others care about you. So we're going to focus on that. That is one of the most commonly researched topics in the area of stress. So I think that's helpful for us to learn about first. Next slide. Over the last 30 years, there has been an increased understanding of the role of relationships in our well-being through neuroscience research. We've learned that in our early development, the quality of our relationships with our parents, our caregivers, impact the development of our neural pathways, and our experiences continue to be impacted in adulthood, right? And so there's an interplay between our social environment and our brain and our ability to handle stress. So we'll cover two of these neural pathways related to relationships today. Next slide. Okay. So one recent discovery by Stephen Porges and researchers was the discovery of the smart vagus branch of the autonomic nervous system. For those that don't know, the autonomic nervous system is one of the primary systems that responds to stress. It handles our involuntary reactions to stress. The discovery of this branch, the smart vagus, helped us better understand how we manage stress and that feeling social cohesion or a closeness to other people supports our feeling of safety and security. Isn't that interesting? So when we are chronically stressed and the smart vagus is overstimulated, all of a sudden our bodies are responding too much to our environments, and our ability to normally determine when we should feel safe or unsafe is just dysregulated. It's thrown off. So it has a harder time distinguishing when to feel safe. Therefore, if we want to build the capacity to regulate the smart vagus and stress, we'll want to engage in certain activities that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Okay. Next slide. The second neural pathway that is helpful to understand in this conversation is the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. That is the pathway that recognizes pain. And what is interesting is that the pain from being socially rejected or physically hurt share the same brain pathways that register this distress. Therefore, when we have early childhood experiences or these long histories of pain and rejection, this neural pathway can also become dysregulated. When it's dysregulated, when it's thrown off, our brains get confused and believe that we are always in danger and pain. This discovery is quite interesting for many reasons. We've learned that having social support actually protects you from physical pain as well as emotional, right? So we are now looking at these interconnections. Our knowledge of this, of social pain overlap theory, also challenges the belief in the West that everyone should be overly independent and that it's a weakness to depend on others. So it challenges this tradition of stigmatizing interdependence and social support. Next slide. On this topic of social pain, When we live in an environment where our bodies are constantly exposed to judgment and feelings of rejection, this becomes a reinforcing cycle. We start to hold ourselves back from others to protect ourselves, and the world then becomes more hostile in response. This cycle of judgment can impact our neural pathway and increase our sensitivity to social pain and rejection. So it's almost like a muscle that we're developing, and it's just being exposed to the same feeling of rejection. Next slide. Luckily, neuroscience and relationship research and our practice experiences have shown that there are things that we can do to heal and build resilience against these big stressors. I will share a quote that I really like. Next slide. I am not aware of any other factor in medicine, not diet, not smoking, not exercise, not stress, not genetics, not drugs, not surgery, that has a greater impact on our quality of life, incidence of illness, and premature death from all causes. And this is by Dr. Dean Ornish on the healing power of love and intimacy, just speaking to the power of love. Next slide. The first step towards your self-care and your self-development should be in self-awareness of what you have and what you need. You do want to ask yourself, how has your personal history and current life circumstances impacted your ability to handle stress? How have your previous training experiences impacted your ability to handle stress? How much empathy do you have for yourself and for others? How are your boundaries? Are you saying yes to things more often to try to feel better about yourself? Are you saying yes because you actually have the time to do those things? Are you using the available resources around you to support your personal well-being, right? Or are you saying, nope, I don't have time? Next slide. I also find it very important to think about building your self-awareness around social and contextual factors. We often look at the person, the individual, and say, take care of yourself, but we don't really think about these other forces and the environments that people are in. So you also want to ask yourself, how is the nature of your work culture supporting your well-being? How is it not? What is the quality of your support systems, and how often do you feel supported? And regarding society and culture, to what extent do societal and cultural expectations influence your well-being? What is in your control to change about these expectations if they cause you additional stress? Next slide. After engaging in deep self-reflection and self-awareness, because that's the first step, you want to decide whether or not you are ready to commit to taking care of yourself, because it's work. It takes some work. If you are committed, you'll want to develop strategies to let go of the things that are causing you pain. And you'll want to gain a sense of achievement and how well you can love yourself and those around you, right? So you want to gain a feeling of mastery that you got this. Next slide. So here are some suggestions that come from my training and experience with self-care and correcting these habits of harm that develop over time. So you want to think about your risk of stress. So if you have childhood experiences of stress and now you're coming into this new environment that maybe feels demanding sometimes, you want to start with your mental health resources to build a new framework for healthy relationships. Because thinking about your neural pathways, those are like muscles, right? And sometimes if you expose yourself to the same thing over and over, your body is prepared to feel pain. It's prepared to feel difficult emotions. So you want to rework that and do some personal work around your cognitions. You also want to look for positive relationships and expose yourself to positive feelings that promote your sense of safety and security. Um, in in contrast, you want to limit exposure to relationships that make you feel unsafe. And this sounds like common sense, but there are some steps that you can take to identify what relationships in your life are you exposed to the most, and are those causing you the most suffering, right? And how do you balance this with relationships that make you feel good? You also want to pursue healthy habits that increase feelings of joy. For example, I know a lot of you are far away from home, and I can kind of connect to that experience being far away from my family as well. So some things you can do from where you are, you can review photo albums of good memories. Maybe you keep them on your phone, or if you're old school, you might have hard photos of your families and friends. Listen to music that reminds you of positive relationships, because these things are activating positive neural pathways in your brain. You can also watch videos of friends and family that bring you back to good moments, and call a friend. If you have been putting that off because you're busy, maybe schedule a monthly call with them. And of course, mindfulness and grounding techniques and physical activity. Again, seem obvious, but they're really important, especially in your rigorous programs. It's good to have tools to slow down and ensure that you're engaged in a structured, wellness schedule. Next slide. Speaking to the spot, the pain overlap theory, one thing that's really important that you can do in terms of community care is to reduce your own pain by increasing acceptance of yourself and other people. Right? So you want to catch yourself when you're judging yourself and other people, because in your mind, you're actually reinforcing this like a muscle, right? Your brain gets used to this, and it subjects you to more emotional pain. And the same thing happens when you judge others, right? So you're creating this false division. Engage others with kindness every day, even when it's difficult to. And these recommendations come from the National Academy of Sciences, the report that I spoke to earlier on what academic communities can do. We want to shift institutional culture and policies, prioritize mental health amid financial constraints, understand the state of student mental health and well-being on each campus, assess institutional capacity to provide the needed services, and develop faculty, staff, and student capability to support emotional well-being and mental health. So we want to spread this, right, and shift culture, so that students are often, and faculty and staff are exposed, to practices that promote the well-being of all people. And I have some examples from, my teaching and what we're doing to do these things and promote these things. Um, but next slide. That is all I have to share for my presentation today. Thank you for joining, and please feel free to email me if you have any questions or if you wish to connect later. Yes, I have a few references slides in the back there. So I asked Damarai and colleagues. Yes, absolutely. So Damarai has my slides. It may be that they can figure out a way to get them to you, but I'd be happy for them to be shared with you.
In your last slide, you mentioned about the faculty, staff, and the students can do a lot in case of wellness of people. So can you give some more suggestions in this regard?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. So this is sort of a multi-systems level effort. In our classes, for example, we have students partner up for accountability. So we call them accountability partners, and it's a buddy system where students look out for each other. It costs no money, and there's no real way to monitor it sometimes, but we do ask students at the end of the semester, how much did your classmates support you? That way we don't have students who feel isolated because they can't have trouble naturally connecting with others. One really hard thing for me as an instructor was loosening my rules, because I love structure. And so during the pandemic, I gave extension deadlines. and I was much more amenable to different formats of assignments. There's the traditional paper, but we also offer different ways for students to submit assignments. And on the school level at the university, they changed the absence policy. So students were able to take self-care absences, I think 3 absences per semester. And they did not have to submit documentation or tell us why they were missing class. So that was a way to give people room to breathe, just because they were under more stress than normal. So those are some examples of top to bottom changes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And I did ask Tamadai if you don't mind joining me on camera, so I'm not alone up here.
Yeah, sure.
It's nice to have company. Oh, thank you so much, Professor.
So I have one more question.
Please, yes.
You said people should make use of the resources that are available. Often the challenge is that, even though resources are available, making sure that people avail these resources. So what is your strategy of spreading this awareness and then making sure that more and more people make use of the resources available?
Oh, what a great question. So one thing I took for granted is that my students didn't know what resources were available. So I love that your wellness center and your team is promoting what is available. So I just repeat myself over and over in class and try to destigmatize accessing resources. Um, Also, on the school level, on the higher level, they also had their disabilities department also accept more emotional disability paperwork. So we made accommodations for students that had more serious mental health issues coming in. And so I think that was also a way to like normalize services so people weren't shy to access them.
Okay, thank you.
Hmm. Those are great questions. Thank you.
Uh, if anyone have any doubts regarding stress management or self-care, so how to help the friends and colleagues working with you in the institution, so you can ask our resource person. So we are here to help you. It's like you can ask, you can turn on your audio also, or you can ask in the chat box. Whichever is comfortable, you can ask.
Yeah, thank you for suggesting that. I would love to see some faces or hear some voices. The chat is also good. But as I was developing this presentation, I was really curious what people already know about this topic, because I know that students on campus, you're engaging in some resources, right? Some physical activity, you have a community because you live on campus. And so there's some good things you're already doing, but hopefully this answered more questions or filled in some gaps around stress.
One question to you: do you mind? Usually we record our sessions and then we will put it in our website of the Wellness Center. So, do you mind sharing this video in the Wellness Center website?
Oh, yeah, thank you for asking. Absolutely. Please feel free to share.
Fine.
Yes, especially if it's helpful to others.
Thank you.
Yes. So I put this presentation together. I was telling Damarai I was super busy this week, so I ran out of time to include a resource slide. Someone read my mind. Can you suggest some reading, self-development books, or bedtime readings on stress management? Yes. And specifically to the topics I was discussing, I do have some recommendations. Let's see if I can find the link really quick. But I'm part of a consortium called the International Center for Growth. Um, and they look a lot, around stress and relationships and social well-being. So it's one of my favorites. And I studied under Dr. Amy Banks, who heads this center. And they also, if you go to their website, they have a questionnaire for you to, a self-questionnaire that you can take online to see how you're doing in terms of the quality of your relationships, how you might be impacted or compromised by what you're being exposed to. So I geek out on that stuff. I hope you enjoy it as well. So I'll just take a quick look and drop that in the chat. Okay, found it. There's also something, and they have a lot of literature online, and it's an active online community as well if you find yourself getting like really curious about it. There, yes, there's also what was coming to mind. Um, It'll come back to me in a moment, I'm sure. But I was thinking about something else. So there is a self-assessment that I've also recommended to my students. And it's a little bit specific to social workers, but I think applies also to the general public on the quality of life. So it's the professional quality of life measure. And they have free resources and a self-assessment online to check in with yourself to see how you're doing in terms of self-compassion, compassion fatigue, burnout. So these are also some resources here. And I wonder if I missed a question. Was there another question in the chat? Or is that it? I think that might be it. Okay, perfect. We're old school. Oh, yes. What a great question about the smartphones. It's interesting because I also, try to get used to this. I'm a little bit old school when it comes to technology. And I find it helpful depending on the space that you're referring to, if it's a classroom or, an outside meeting space, to set up some ground rules about expectations of each other, right? And just as a sign of respect. So if you want to come up with a few ground rules to see what people are comfortable with, maybe we can say, limit your phone use to just break time, because we do benefit from that quality time, especially nowadays in COVID, we have limited human interaction. So I think that might be a fair request if it comes from a loving place in your request. How to make a comfortable environment if anyone approaches you for such issues. In these cases, people mainly want to listen to what they want. Oh, so perhaps if someone comes to you with an experience of stress or like a situation where they're going through something, is that right? Um, Typically, I have found that people just want to be listened to. So I think your intuition to just be there to listen is usually sufficient. Obviously, if you are concerned about their well-being, if they're at risk of harm, you'll want to let them know that you have to share that to make sure that they're safe. But other than that, I have found in my client work, student work, all over, people just want to be heard because not many of us are listening. So it can be very powerful. Hopefully that was your question. You can let me know if you're asking something else. Okay, good, good. Yeah, that's such a struggle. I find especially it might just be social workers, maybe it's everybody, but when you hear a story, you want to do something. You always want to be active, but it's never, usually not something someone needs you to do, right? They just need you to be there. Any other questions, comments?
So I think you have one more question.
Oh, yes. So my professor, Amy Banks, again, who's part of the, she's a psychiatrist, but she teaches social workers as well on, neuroscience of relationships and social well-being. And so she, in her slides, really recommended a lot of those sort of mantra meditations. And I did not include them in my slides, but I know that it's a great fit. It is a really great fit for addressing a lot of the stressors, the impact of stress in terms of cognitions. Um, Often we're stressing ourselves out because we're stuck in a cycle of, of negative thinking, right? And negative interactions. I think that would be great. Yeah. Thank you for asking. Do introvert people face more stress? Yeah, so I don't know if others are familiar with this book, but I just read Quiet by Susan Cain. And that was my break reading between the semesters recently. And I identify as an introvert and I'm very shy. And so I do think because we are more introspective and we're also known to have high sensitivity to, it's not fake, it's real. We're actually very sensitive to the environment, is what I learned. And so I think we tend to maybe go deeper into our thinking, into our problem focused areas. um, and so perhaps we do face different kinds of stress, at least, if not more. Um, I'd be curious what you do if you're an introvert, to cope with that kind of rumination. But I find having extroverted friends is actually quite helpful. People to bring me out from just thinking and ruminating and cycling, right? To be social and interactive, more physical. Because what I want to do is grab a book and sit at home. But, what I really need is to engage, even if it's virtual, music class, drama, something interactive with others. So that's usually my medicine, is extroverted company or extroverted activities. That's another great question. Yeah, it looks like people agreed. We're thinking the same thing.
Friends, do you have any other questions right now? So, Christine, I have a question. So,
Sure.
students, it's like not only students, it maybe you and me. So, if some warning signs, if you
Mm.
want to tell some warning signs, they should definitely meet the mental health professional. So, when will you recommend?
Oh, in terms of the warning signs, yes. Um, I would say if you're noticing that slide with the behavior and et cetera, emotional and cognitive changes, if you're starting to identify those stressors and you notice that they've been longer than is comfortable, maybe a few weeks, I would try to focus on prevention, because unfortunately, it often gets worse when we try to deal with things by ourselves. I would say without exception, I've talked to people I supervise and students about burnout, and no one listens until it's, they're deep in the experience and they go, oh, I feel awful now. And then they go, and it takes longer to recover because you've waited so long to get help. So you have these great resources on campus. I would use them as soon as you start realizing, oh, you've been unwell for a long time, maybe a couple weeks you're not feeling like yourself.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you all for the work you're doing. I just learned how big your campus is, and what you all have been going through in this pandemic. So kudos to all of you. I wish you all the best, as you balance these demands and take care of yourselves.
So, if there is no more questions, we can wind up, I guess.
Hmm. Sounds good. Oh, thank you. Is that Professor? Oh, that's so kind. Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a wonderful experience preparing for this and being with you today. Hopefully I can be there in person one day if I'm lucky.
I think many people are clapping you for
Oh,
presentation.
yes, thank you, thank you. I hope it was helpful, that you learned a little bit and you're curious to dig in more. It's a big topic, so.
So I think we can wind up. So,
Okay, sure.
sir,
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Christian Holmes,
Yeah.
and we will keep in touch with you for future events also. Thank you very
Oh,
much. Thank
I'd
you
love
all the
that.
participants also.
Yes, thank you all. Have a great day and weekend.
Yeah, thank you.
thank you, Christian. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tamare, for arranging this webinar.
Yes. Bye, everybody. Take care.